My name is S.K. Williams. And happy birthday, America. But what's more, happy biquincentennial. America turns 250 years old today, celebrating its birth and the birth of liberty around the world and our new democratic order that freed us from the tyranny of kings, starting with that tyrant king, King George III. Of course, King George III wasn't really a tyrant. America's founding fathers said he was to justify their revolution. And it is odd that in time when we are told that there is no room for political violence, we would celebrate people who use political violence to create the modern world. It's a modern world that grew out of the American Revolution because even though the American Revolution drew its ideas from the Enlightenment ideas and principles, the Revolution gave those forms and justification and led to the French Revolution, which modern conservatives say was the bad revolution unrelated to America, the evil anti-clerical one that was way more violent and worse, but America's was different because it was pure and good and led by good men. America's founding fathers weren't really purer or more good than the French revolutionaries. They just didn't have the ability to actually drag the king from his palace and kill him. And they also were half revolutionaries. America's revolutionaries were not really the idealists fighting purely for liberty because they saw the suffering of the masses and said, no more. They had ulterior motives, although the ulterior motives are complex to discuss because they varied depending upon which founding father you were dealing with. As such, I would like to begin a series studying the American Revolution to commemorate America's 250th birthday. It's probably not something we should do now, though, because I'm already taking the wind out of the sails of the celebration, as it were, by my criticisms. So I shall be brief with them. It doesn't change the fact, though, that America's revolution did more to the world than people seem to realize. Because of America's revolution, 4 countries were created, not just one. Canada was also created as a result of the American Revolution, as was Jamaica and the Bahamas. And we also had effects back in Britain. The Whigs used it to thoroughly discredit the monarchy, which at the time was not really an absolute monarchy, claiming a divine right of kings to rule. In fact, that's one of the myths that I've always hated, this idea that the divine right of kings is something that the kings in the Dark Ages in Europe claimed, and it justified their absolute rule and their ability to treat the peasants as mere property and do whatever they wanted. The concept of the divine right of kings, of course, doesn't say that the king has unlimited political power and can do whatever he wants. It rather just says that the king is appointed by God and cannot be held to a higher authority than that whilst executing his office. It does not say that the king can do anything, though. And ultimately, even though we associate it with the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages, the concept of the divine right of kings is actually an early modern one. It grew out of ideas, of course, that were in the Middle Ages, but the actual concept was early modern, and it was French. And the theory wasn't really held in Britain, especially by the time of King George III. King George III never claimed the divine right of kings to rule, and certainly never had absolute power. And what little power he did have left was regulated by the Act of Settlement in 1688, which also asserted parliamentary supremacy. In other words, the king ruled at the discretion of Parliament. But the king did have certain powers, certain executive functions that remained to him. Powers that were largely stripped from him after the American Revolution by the Whig government that was sympathetic to the American Revolution, using that as an excuse. And it led to the tendency around the world to have a liberal, secular, democratic order. So much so that in our world, we can say a government is not legitimate just by saying it was not duly elected by the people. And we don't seem to realize how utterly foreign that is to historical thinking, that this is a very unique moment, that most of the world's countries are democracies. even the ones that we say are not democracies claim to be, and it is the only legitimate form of government. And we don't seem to realize how unique that is historically. And it all started with this glorious American Revolution, which people will say was good, because democracy is good. It means we are free. Historically, people were slaves, but that's really oversimplifying it. People had freedom in various forms of government. Even an absolute monarchy can have its people be free. And I'm not saying that to advocate absolute monarchy. I'm just pointing that out. But I am a monarchist. And I believe that the monarch should be independent of the parliament and have actual executive functions. I know people are critical of King Charles, especially after his change of defender of the faith to defender of multi-faith. But King Charles is a product of centuries of devaluation of the monarchy, and is ultimately a puppet of whatever Parliament tells him to do. And the modern British Parliament has no checks on its power, which is ironic because even though a lot of Americans, especially if they're conservative, think America's founding fathers created the concept of checks and balances because they got tired of Britain, or rather England. They always call it the King of England and say America broke from England when it was really Britain. But they act like the king was an absolute monarch, and America's founders realized concentrating power in one man was wrong and created the separation of powers. And certain conservatives will say that this is based on the Bible, because there's a verse in Isaiah that says the Lord is our king, the Lord is our lawgiver, the Lord is our judge. And the founders read that and came up with the three branches of government, so it's inherently Christian. And they'll even say that Christians have always believed that there is no king but King Jesus, and the kings in the Dark Ages, which, again, even though this is wrong, it will be said, they'll say they reigned by pretending to have a divine right of kings, which gave them unlimited power to do whatever they want. But that was anti-Christian and corruption. Real Christians support republicanism, and the American Revolution put power where it belongs, with we the people. And they'll see progressives as neo-feudalists wanting to go back to monarchy. Of course, progressives view conservatives as monarchists and talk about King Donald Trump these days. But it's not really true. And America's founders guarantee that we will have a cycle of progressivism because they only want to go back to the founding fathers and their vision. And the founding fathers' vision is what gave us progressivism. It's just a different strain of the same thought. And it's why we had the woke movement, and it's why we are losing our civilization. Because the modern democratic order is an insane one that ultimately favors popular imagination and sets us all at variance with each other with nothing to unite us. And modern liberal secular democracy is ultimately based on a religion called secularism. Secularism is not a lack of a religion, it's not neutrality toward religion, it's its own religion. And it has its own values that it forces on us. It's not neutral in any regard. And ultimately, the question is how far you go with it. Some want to admix it with Christianity, some want pure secularism, but it doesn't matter. At the end of the day, it's the same poison. I find the American Revolution, which embodied Enlightenment principles, a great mistake on history that scarred it. And all of the problems we see with atomized individualism, the idea that liberty trumps everything so long as the liberty is the liberty to do things that people would think are morally wrong, the idea that religion should not be considered in government even though it always is, just secular religion this time, or that even if it is considered it must be separated, which conservatives actually believe. A lot of the liberals think that the conservatives want a theocracy, a government ruled by religion. And I've always hated that for two reasons. The first is, a theocracy is not a government ruled by religion. It's a government whose head of state is a god. And the second, the government ruled by religion would be an ecclesiocracy. And second, conservatives don't really want that, but we'll never understand each other at this point. We have an endless warfare caused by these great ideals that we're supposed to love. And I've always thought a real system of checks and balances should exist, with different franchises run differently rather than them all being democratically elected and thus the same. And in Britain, you can see our love of democracy has completely eroded the system. The king is not free to do what he wants. He must do what Parliament tells him. And even the king's speech is written for him by the Prime Minister and his people. And the House of Lords does not have the right to stop legislation passed by Commons. It used to. In the past, the House of Commons would originate all legislation it would pass to the Lords. This is where the American system actually came from. But the Lords could vote against the legislation and kill it. Now they can't. Now the only power they have is the power to delay and to suggest change, but they can't change it themselves. And they can't ultimately stop legislation. And that's because the House of Lords is not duly democratically elected. Only the Commons is democratically elected, and therefore only the Commons has real power. And we've gotten rid of the last of the hereditary peers, and now the Lords are all appointees. And there are talks of further reforms, where we will either abolish the House of Lords entirely and have a unicameral system, or have an elected Senate. But one thing is for certain, there was no rational justification for having hereditary peers, and there certainly isn't ever going to be. And even the current system isn't rationally defensible because it's not democratically elected. And if we do change the Parliament, they will eventually disestablish the Church, and a lot of conservatives will share that because the Church of England has gone woke and it's super progressive, and they won't seem to realise that that doesn't matter. Because the Church of England did not go progressive on its own. It went progressive because it was controlled by Parliament, and Parliament is the House of Commons now. All of the bishops being woke and progressive, that's because they were appointed by politicians that want to promote that order, and ultimately want the Church to go into managed decline so they could de-Christianize society. And once they weaken the constitutional structure enough, they will disestablish the Church. And once they do that, they will abolish the monarchy, because they're socialists running on a Fabian scheme. They literally work for the Fabian society. And all of that goes back to America too, because the socialists of the 19th century the 19th century looked to America as their model and their guide and their inspiration. They wanted a United States of Europe, and that vision gave us the European Union. And ultimately, Britain is being punished for Brexit. It's not that Brexit failed, it's that it was murdered. We're being punished for that. And ultimately, the vision is for a one-world government, a world state, run on the new values, the socialist principles, the humanism. And that's what Davos is largely promoting, and it's the story that grew out of the American Revolution. And I'm not, by the way, presenting a conspiracy theory. People like H.G. Wells said all of this himself, and you can read it in things like The Shape of Things to Come, or other works by Wells, but he was not alone saying this. You can read similar sentiments in George Bernard Shaw, or in Carl Pearson. You could see Andrew Draper, or John Draper saying the same things. You could say Charles Bradlaugh saying the same things. George Jacob Holyoake. They obviously want something, and it's obviously inspired by the Enlightenment and the American Revolution. So I'm very ambivalent to that. But I can't be totally ambivalent to the day, since there is one other little odd twist, especially coming from this monarchist. The 4th of July happens to be my own birthday. I was born on the 4th of July in Tennessee, so naturally I should be a flag-waving patriot, but I'm not. And I'm not exactly a progressive who hates America either, although I will probably be accused of that by certain conservatives who make no difference. But I am a monarchist and a traditionalist, and I was born on the 4th of July in East Tennessee. But I don't have much else to say, so I shall take my leave now. Thank you, God bless, and goodbye.